Well, happy Monday and welcome to In the Word. We are continuing in Ezekiel through the week. Ezekiel chapters 39 and 41. I was just looking at my reading plan here. We'll be in Ezekiel till Wednesday and then into the book of Daniel by the 27th of September. We'll be in Matthew. So you'll have gone through the whole Old Testament. Good for you guys. Proud of you for continuing in the Word, working our way through the Old Testament and into the New Testament, and have read all of God's Word by the end of the year. I've been getting some questions about, am I going to do something next? Will there be a follow-on? I think what I'm planning on doing right now is to, if you continue with me, is we'll slow down in 2021 and look closely at the life of Jesus. So we'll take all the Gospels, arrange them chronologically, and we'll just slow down and look at the life of Jesus day by day. This weekend you went through a very interesting section of Ezekiel. We're in the end of the book, chapters 33 through 48. Talk about the restoration of Israel. So up to this point, we've seen Ezekiel's vision, then we've seen condemnation for Judah and Jerusalem, then condemnations of the nations, and then in this section we move into the restoration of Israel, that God is going to continue to be faithful to the people he has made this covenant with. So in chapters 33 through 39, we see the new life for Israel, and 40 to 48, we see a new order for Israel in this section. So when you went through the weekend, chapter 33 was about the recommissioning of the watchman. Ezekiel starts a new phase of his ministry. He's established as a watchman, and then in chapter 34, a real discussion about shepherds. First, the false shepherds that are leading Israel astray. And we've seen this throughout the Bible so far, that as the nation, as the leaders, so goes the nation. The leaders have led Israel astray. First, the northern 10 tribes, and then the southern 2 tribes have been led astray by their leaders. And God assures them that the true shepherd will reappear. A true shepherd of God himself will come and lead his people. Then we see in chapters 35 and 36 the nation being reborn. And that's what we see there. We see in those 2 chapters the nation bit by bit coming together. First coming together in apparent unbelief, and then to be resuscitated in chapters 37, this fulfillment of Jeremiah's new covenant. We'll go into the end time significance of that. I've talked about this before. I think some of this is going on right now. It's being fulfilled, but we won't slow down for that. When we get toward into the New Testament, we'll look at the book of the Olivet Discourse and the book of Revelation, and we'll pull these threads together. Chapters 38 and 39 is a relatively well-known section about the attack on Israel by a northern coalition of forces that come, and how they invade Israel in chapter 38, and how in chapter 39 that invasion is repulsed and Israel has victory over its enemies. Again, lots of significance for the end times, a lot of different discussion about how those battles fit into the narrative of the book of Revelation. Some people think it happens before Revelation. Other people think it happens early. Others that it happens late. So I'll discuss that and where that fits in when we get to the book of Revelation. But right now, I want you to focus on just that battle is occurring, that battle is coming. And as Revelation goes on, not the book of Revelation, but God's revelation of his plan is going to be developed and built out more and more. So today we see the victory in chapter 39, And we see this beginning of the new order starting in chapter 40 and through the end of the book. So chapter 39, I've labeled this defeat. I've called this defeat, and it's divided into a number of sections. There's an introduction here, first of all, to kind of orient you to what's going on. And then we see it moves into the defeat of the invaders. So by the end of verse 6, you've seen a short introduction and then the defeat of these invaders. And then 7 through, I think, through the rest of the book, down to verse 24, let's say, I'd refer to this as the post-battle cleanup is what's happening in Israel. There's been a massive battle, massive bloodletting, massive death and destruction. And there's this cleanup operation that's happening immediately after that battle. Verse 7 begins that cleanup, and we see in verse 8 and following the cleanup of the weapons. And then beginning in verse 11, cleanup of the corpses. And that continues down into verse 17, where the carrion, that is scavengers, sorts of birds and animals, are called to eat the flesh and blood of Israel's enemy. Very grotesque, but this is what's going to happen. Also, it's interesting to note how in those verses, animal sacrifice is kind of turned around. Up to this point in the Bible, we've seen plenty of animals being sacrificed. Now we see people being sacrificed and the animals benefiting from that. So again, kind of macabre, kind of gross, but it's God's plan. Whatever God does is right, and this is going to be what's going to happen after this battle. That goes down to verse 21. And then in 21 through 24 is this affirmation from God that all these events, this battle, the victory, and the return of Israel to their land is going to be a proof that he exists. Proof to Israel and then proof to the nations as well, that God is going to prove himself. And then verse 25 and following in that chapter is this final assurance before we head into this new section about the temple and this new order. Final assurance, another assurance from God that he is going to restore the people of Israel to their land and to unity and to worshiping him. He is going to do that. Again, we've seen in Jeremiah 31 this new covenant that's going to be carried out with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, where he is going to transform them internally. And that's what's going to happen here. He said in verse 28, then they shall know that I am the Lord their God, because I set them into exile among the nations and then assembled them into their own land. I will leave none of them remaining among the nations anymore. So we see a hint here of how this devastation of Israel is going to work out ultimately to God's glory. And that is his overall plan throughout the Bible. It's not salvation, as important as salvation is, but it's to bring glory to himself. Salvation is just a way that he does that. We see this, the salvation of Israel and the salvation of the church, as we see that in the New Testament. So this ends this section about new life, and we begin a new section about a new order. This has got our final marking, date and time marking in the book of Ezekiel. We can date this to April 28th, 573. So this is after the exiles, the final exiles of 586 have been well settled in Babylon. And it's made clear in the first 4 verses that this is a vision for Israel, that this is not for the church, that the church doesn't take over these promises in some way. This is not a vision about the church. This is a vision for Israel. And we're going to enter a section here that's going to be very reminiscent of Leviticus and Deuteronomy in the excruciating detail that the Lord provides, because this is going to literally happen. That's why he's providing these details. If you have questions about this last 8 chapters, I'd encourage you to go look at what I released on Saturday. I call it the Saturday Special about Ezekiel's temple. It's about 45 minutes, so set aside some time. If you're here in Colorado, living near me, it's supposed to snow tomorrow. It's supposed to be 6 inches of snow. So that might be a good time for you to settle in if you're here and listen to that section about Ezekiel's temple. So after the first 4 verses of chapter 40, we see the description of the outer court of the temple. So this is kind of a description given to Ezekiel going from the inside out of the temple. So first starts with the outer court, and then, I'm having trouble turning pages here, verse 28 moves to the inner court of chapter 40 here. And then moving into end of chapter 40, we see a switch moves from the inner and outer court, starting in verse 48 and going down to 41. Chapter 41, verse 26, we see a picture of the temple itself. So I've labeled the chapter 40, the inner and outer court, chapter 41, the outer and inner sanctuary. So begins with a description down to verse 14 as this chambers or these rooms that surround the inner sanctuary of the church of the temple. Describes this inside walls. There's going to be rooms in there that serve different functions. And then in verse 15, it begins a description of the outer walls of the temple. So that'll guide you through this section. Again, if you'd care to take the time to look at this in detail, I'd encourage you to do that. Otherwise, this is one of those places in the Bible that you might want to skim through. We've done this before. Don't feel guilty about doing that, but to go through that in a high-level way, and I'm just trying to get the big picture of how this enormous temple is going to be put together, and just note the detail that's provided here. Again, reminiscent of what we saw in Exodus, in the description of the tabernacle, and then later in Leviticus in the description of the sacrifices. Just as the tabernacle was a real, literal tabernacle, the sacrifices were real sacrifices that were to be made, so the detail in this temple indicates that this is going to be a literal temple, the 4th temple. And again, for details about that, I'd ask you to go take a look at the Ezekiel's temple that was released on Saturday. So God bless you, brothers and sisters. Enjoy your reading of God's Word. May you be slowly but unavoidably transformed into the image of Jesus through the reading of God's Word. God bless you.